In this module unit, we're going now finally to look at how connectionist networks in the 80s and 90s were used to theorize, think, and study actual human development. It was necessary to get a great deal of the preliminaries out of the way in order to understand the various roles that networks and researchers are playing in this business. There was a great deal of such work in the 80s and 90s. There's still some. This has never, of course, died out. But it emerged as a very significant paradigm for thinking about human development and learning in the 80s and 90s. And we're going to take through at least one very carefully worked example. Now, an untrained network, a network that we have yet to adjust the weights on, has a whole bunch of random weights, and so when we present it with any inputs, the outputs it produces bear a random relation to those inputs. After training, we presume that the training process has adjusted those weights such that the outputs now bear a meaningful relationship to the inputs. Furthermore, it's usually hoped that the outputs will generalize so that if an input is drawn from the same domain that was not used in training, the output will still make sense in the same way that it makes sense for those patterns on which it was trained. Interpreting the inputs and outputs of the networks, as I've been at pains to point out, is the responsibility of the modeler. It is a human activity and not a network activity. You may find it somewhat surprising how indirect that relationship is. That is, what a great deal of work the interpretation of the patterns is doing and how little work the patterns are doing. But we have here a modeling toolkit that was of particular interest to researchers in human development because it allowed certain long-standing questions to be come at with fresh eyes, as it were, in which one could use a modeling paradigm to trade off the specificity of the notional subject and the complexity of the world to see just how the capacities of the developed organism might arise from the interplay of endogenous factors within the body and exogenous factors in the complexity of the world. Infants, much like our networks, seem to pass through stages. Initially, they don't produce very intelligible responses to things in the world. They are very self-centered, little infants, and over time, their responses to the world become themselves more complex. The world for them becomes a more articulated place with greater variety of opportunities. And so the capacities that they exert in their form of interaction with the world likewise becomes more differentiated. And so there is a long-lasting debate, at least several hundred years old, in which different sides have argued for a greater role for the child or a greater role for the contribution of the world. And by the world here, I don't just mean the physical surrounds, I mean also the attention, care, interactions with others, the social and cultural environment, the language, all these are real elements of the world that the infant faces. So on the one side, we have the suggestion that the child is born with a great deal of internal specificity, with a kind of a set of innate and differentiated capacities, which only need to be fine-tuned through exposure to the world. That would be what we're going to call the rationalist perspective. And the alternative emphasis is on the richness of the world, which would suggest that the child is relatively unformed, not, as an extreme version of this would put it, a blank slate, undoubtedly born with lots of differentiation. Nevertheless, the empiricist counterproposal is that the differentiation that we find and the set of diverse capacities that we find in the developed individual arise crucially through the interaction with a highly differentiated world that itself displays lots of meaningful variation. And one question that unites these is, what form of learning mechanism might one appeal to in order to understand this emergence? Is the learning mechanism simply kind of a generic, perhaps attention-based kind of process in which infants simply attend to lots of things in the world, and the world then surprises them and induces changes? Or are the attentional capacities of the infant already highly differentiated? The rationalist perspective on this appeals to pre-existing differentiations, suggesting that there are domain-specific principles of learning, so that there are already, for example, certain tendencies to listen to the kind of stuff that's going to turn out to be linguistic. And that's quite separate from the kind of stuff that will enable, for example, fine motor control. We have capacities in so many different areas. Nobody's ever been able to enumerate them. In a developed individual, they're legion. Some people play the piano, we all converse, some people dance, we have lots and lots of abilities. The rationalist perspective suggests that the ultimate mastery of a domain arises from a readiness to engage with that domain. This lives on, for example, in our general treatment of the notion of talent in an individual. We say that someone is born talented, not that they acquire talent. And the word talent is very strongly associated with this idea of an inbuilt specific resonance for a specific kind of interaction with the world. Against this, empiricists draw attention to the complexity of the world and the unformedness of the child, and suggest that the differentiation that undoubtedly occurs emerges from the interaction of a highly plastic system in the child, that is a system which is capable of being formed in very many ways, with the specificities of the world. So these are not teams in a football match. We don't want to say rationalists are right and empiricists are wrong. Rather, these have emerged as poles of emphasis in consideration of human development since at least the 18th century. And as we go along and we look at some worked examples, it's worth noting that both sides here, the empiricists and the rationalist sides here, share the conviction, they simply start with the assumption that it's appropriate to speak of the competences that a person exhibits as grounded in the structures, the specific structures of the brain, which are often described as representations. This view is very widespread, but it's not the only view in town, but we're not going to pursue other views here. A significant contribution to this debate came in 1983 from Jerry Fodor, a philosopher who worked alongside Noam Chomsky, the linguist, and was central in setting up what we now regard as the cognitivist view of the person. His book was called The Modularity of Mind, an essay on faculty psychology. Jerry Fodor was always provocative. He died a few years ago, but he was great fun. And his title here is deliberately inflammatory because the idea of faculty psychology, he's resurrecting a very, very old idea here. It goes back to rather more naive days when one spoke with facility of the faculty of reason or the faculty of language. This is a now outdated view that the brain divides and the mind divides, the person divides into these different kinds of abilities. What he's trying to do is take this old intuition and give it a modern spin, but he's deliberately provoking with that title. One thing he points out is that the newborn infant has some incredible capacities long before it has any rich interaction with the world at all. So the day it's born, the infant seems to distinguish speech sounds from other sounds. Of course, the day it's born is not the first day of life. Infants have a period inside the womb, and recognizing where the infant is as we go back in time is a little bit difficult, but undoubtedly for the last 3 months they are hearing a lot through the womb. So they're not without exposure, but in the womb, this external sounds are heavily filtered, muffled, so that what the infant hears in the womb might be more like that. By day 4, there's some evidence, it's controversial, but there's some evidence that the infant is sensitive to aspects of the ambient language in particular and can differentiate it from unrelated languages. The specifics of this particular claim relate to large differences between language, for example, between English and Japanese, and not to what we might think of much closer related languages. So this claim does not apply to infants don't distinguish between English and Dutch, for example, but they will distinguish between English and Japanese. By 3 months of age, infants seem to be developing a strong sense of expectation as to how solid objects in the physical world work. From Jerry Fodor's point of view, this kind of faculty is the development of a naive physical theory. They express surprise if 2 objects occupy the same location at 3 months, and at 4 months they express surprise if they see one solid thing going through another. That may be changing a little bit as children are exposed to screens an awful lot where we see such nonsense going on all the time. But this work is older than that. At 7 months they can be shown, or one can conclude, that they have a naive understanding of gravity and mass. But the most important skill, capacity exhibited by very young children is the manner in which they learn language. They learn language really, really quickly. We all know that learning a new language is an impossibly difficult task. It's really hard. And at your age, it's a very, very difficult task. And yet every human infant, unless there's something seriously wrong, picks it up with no trouble whatsoever. And at this time, there was a very important claim, the poverty of the stimulus claim, which asserted, without evidence, that the input, the linguistic input a child was exposed to was itself insufficient for learning language, and that therefore the child had to provide a lot of the structures and capacities for discrimination that underlie language learning. So all of these observations speak to the debate around what's built in and what's learned. Jeff Ellman is one of the authors of the PDP books. You will have read at this stage a summary of a book he produced with a lot of other people called Rethinking Innateness. And in that book he makes the claim, so he's arguing for the empiricist side, and he makes the claim that infants don't necessarily have these kind of specific capacities, talents, if you will, but rather they have certain innate predispositions to attend to some things over others in the environment. And by being drawn this way or that way, they then encounter different kinds of properties of the world. And through this, the representations, structures, and processes that are necessary to support activity in the world emerge from these interactions between environment and brains, and between, I don't like that use of the word brains, and between interactions within the brain. One thing that's of note and that's very important here is that humans have a very, very long period in which they are not fully formed. In fact, the biological development of the human body is not completed until about age 21. And human infants are particularly helpless at birth, a point we'll come back to. The suggestion is that this relative plasticity is very important in considering the rapid development of capacities in the child, because precisely this being helpless allows them to be plastic, that is formable by their environment, and that therefore they might not need much more than some general predispositions to attend to one feature of the world and some rather generic learning mechanisms in order for the differentiated capacities to emerge. Here's the kind of language Jeff Hellman uses in discussing this. He says, we show how domain-specific representations can emerge from domain-general architectures and learning algorithms, and how these can ultimately result in a process of modularization as the end product of development rather than its starting point. Notice how the language has changed here. First of all, the language of representation and architecture is clearly the language of neural network modeling. Right? We've moved a little bit away from waving our hands. I mentioned structures, capacities, processes, and representations, all just to indicate that the brain is obviously doing something. We need to attribute some responsibility to it if we want to understand how people do anything. But notice that the language has become sharper and more tailored to considering connectionist models in this. And notice also that Hellman shares Jerry Fodor's desire to account for a highly differentiated suite of capacities, and what you might call a modular architecture that is different capacities. So the ability to play the piano is relatively independent of the ability to juggle, which is relatively independent of the ability to speak Spanish. Hellman's way of laying this out speaks to an empirical agenda in which, through our modeling, we can play with the complexity of the world, play with the specificity of the architecture, and play with the learning methods exhibited by the system. And so this opened up a modeling agenda and a domain of scientific theorizing which spoke to some very long-standing concerns. Playing off the world against the infant, as it were, rejuvenated this field of development psychology. And the claims by various people in the field of developmental psychology could be scrutinized newly, asking a set of very pointed questions that had been a bit vague, but became much more precise in the context of a connectionist modeling agenda. You know, what have you attributed to the infant? What have you attributed to the world? What learning algorithms, and how specific are those learning algorithms to one domain or another domain? So this sets up a ground for some very fruitful work in developmental psychology.